Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. As we begin our next step further into Romanticism, the next thing we need to do is to talk about subjectivity. And what subjectivity deals with, it deals with perspective. Not only for narration, but also for the idea of viewing and what someone can know as real and true. One way to think about subjectivity would be to think about two different people who grew up during the same time, right, the same years. And if one person, say for example, grew up poor and the other person grew up rich, even though they were living during the same times, right, growing up during the same years, their perspective on the world would be very different, right, because of how they were raised. So what they would view as real and true would be very different. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And you could think about this in terms of not necessarily rich and poor, but somebody grew up in a city and another person grew up in a rural environment, right? They would have a different outlook on the world, a different way of viewing things. And so for these different people, that's held as true. This is what's also called a solipsism. So when we think about subjectivity and how this works into writing, is that when we encounter the I in a work of literature, here with poetry, it's oftentimes going to be the poet, him or herself. So then what this allows the poet to give his or her expression of what he or she views as real and true. And for the poem that we're about to take a look at in a few moments, when we hear I in the poem Tintern Abbey, it is, without question, William Wordsworth himself. And in terms of the history of literature, right, going through as we've moved away from the Enlightenment and we keep going further into Romanticism, this idea is just as new and groundbreaking as writing without rhyme and meter, like we saw before. The heroic couplet, gone. If you want the poem to rhyme, great, super, that's fantastic. But we're not bound by rules. Always remember, the R in Romanticism is revolution. And this is one of the revolutions that we see in Romanticism. Today, in the 21st century, this is commonplace for us to read a poem or a short story that represents the perspective, the solipsism of the author. But this was really groundbreaking for the time. So now, let's take this idea and let's jump into our next poem. You might have noticed, taking a look at the text and the syllabus, right? There's this, Tintern Abbey, and then this. Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13, 1798. And this great big extended title has shortened itself down over the years to just Tintern Abbey. So when we refer to the poem and you refer to the poem, right? It's just referred to as Tintern Abbey. So this raises a question. What is Tintern Abbey? Well, Abbey, it's an old church that was destroyed during the Protestant Reformation under King Henry VIII. It's still there today. It's a tourist spot today. People like to go there and walk around the ruins. It's in a very woodland setting. I haven't been there. I'd love to go. And it's not only a tourist spot today, but it was during the time when Wordsworth was alive. So what was common for the day is for people to go on walking tours. They would go on ramblings, and they would have different places that they would visit, right? And they would just walk along and see beautiful sights, be uplifted, if you remember from previous lecture, experience the sublime transcendence, right? They were seeking these transcendental moments. And this is what Wordsworth was doing. In case you're curious, this poem is based upon a real experience for William Wordsworth. He went on a walking tour with some people, including his sister Dorothy, and during the walking tour, this poem, right, he wrote it in his mind when he was going on the walking tour. And then they reached their destination, and then William Wordsworth got out his pen and paper, and he wrote this poem. Boom. It just poured forth from his mind. Amazing, amazing poem, I know. So what do we know just from looking at this title? Right, so we know where we are, right? We're a few miles above Tintern Abbey, and we have a river, the banks of the Wye. So here we have this nice, beautiful setting, and, right, revisiting. So Wordsworth has been here before. So this brings into play an important aspect of this poem, which is memory and reflection. And what we will see is that memory and reflection will be added to nature. You remember why we're capitalizing nature, right? Is that for the Romantics, many of the Romantics, that nature is displacing God, Scripture, prayer in terms of divinity and reaching and seeking the divinity. That's what these transcendentalists were doing. So then, right? So then we add in these aspects of the sublime, and then boom, what happens? We have transcendence, right? In addition to slanty handwriting. And that's what these people during this time were out there seeking, these moments of transcendence. And for Wordsworth, the poem, at surface, seems to be a very simple reflection of the poet, which it is, but it's so deep and there's so much for us to dig into.